Thank you, Ben. I'll go ahead and get started. First, I'd like to thank you all for participating in 1455's second annual literary festival. We hope you'll help us spread awareness by sharing your impressions via social media, linking the 1455 Facebook page, and signing up for our newsletter. We also hope you'll dig deeper into the work of our authors. Their books are available for purchase via the links on the agenda page of the LitFest website. All purchases will be shipped directly to your door. 1455 is delighted to be partnering with the Potter's House on book sales this year. They're a nonprofit bookstore, cafe, and event space in Washington, D.C., with a deep history of social justice and community building. Learn more about their work at www.pottershousedc.org. Okay, without further ado, let me introduce our panelists. And remember, we hope to make these sessions as interactive as possible. So please use the chat room to submit your questions, and we'll do our best to get to all of them. Our first speaker today is Cliff Garstang. He is the author of The House of the Ancients and Other Stories. He's also author of the novel The Shaman of Turtle Valley, a novel and stories entitled What the Zang Boys Know, and that one won the Library of Virginia Award for Fiction. He also authored the prize-winning short story collection In an Uncharted Country. He's the editor of the 3-volume anthology series Everywhere Stories, Short Fiction from a Small Planet. These are stories set around the world, and he's also the co-founder of and former editor of the Prime Number magazine. Cliff is a former international lawyer, and he now lives in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. Jessi Lewis grew up on a blueberry farm in rural Virginia. Influenced by her childhood in the mountains and the experiences of the women in her family, there's often a hint of mythology, magic, and oddity thrown into her work. Her essays, short stories, and poems have been published in Oxford American, Carve, Sonora Review, The Pinch, Yosemite, and Appalachian Heritage, among others. Jessi's novel manuscript, She Spoke Wire, was a finalist for the Penn Bellwether Prize for Socially Engaged Fiction. Oxford American chose her short story, False Morals, as the 2018 debut fiction winner. Her work has been supported by the Tin House Summer Workshop and Breadloaf Environmental. Jessi has her MFA from my undergraduate alma mater, West Virginia University. She now teaches writing in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. And my name is Debra Lattanzi Shutika. I'm a folklorist and creative writer at George Mason University. My research focuses on critical race, sense of place, and Appalachian studies. I received a PhD and MA in folklore and folklife from the University of Pennsylvania, and an MA in American literature from George Mason University. I teach digital storytelling, Appalachian folklore, and sense of place. I'm author of Beyond the Borderlands, Migration and Belonging in the United States and Mexico, and the associate editor for the Journal of American Folklore. I also write mystery fiction, which has appeared in the Bouchercon anthologies in 2018 and 19, and I have one literary piece out that was an Abundant Grace fiction by Washington area women. So with that, let's get started. I'd like to ask both Cliff and Jessi to do a short reading as we begin. So Cliff, would you like to start?
Sure, I'd be happy to start. I'm going to read from the prologue to my novel, The Shaman of Turtle Valley, because we are talking about writing in the valley and talking about place. And I wrote this prologue as a way of really setting the stage, the setting, for the story I was telling about a Korean woman in the Shenandoah Valley. Deb mentioned House of the Ancients, which is my new story collection, but that also deals with a lot of different places, not just the valley. So here is the first couple of pages of The Shaman of Turtle Valley. The stones have been here forever, and they will outlast everyone. The mountain streams have always flowed and always will, reaching out for fertile lands in an endless, welcoming grasp. When the first white settlers arrived in this corner of the Great Valley of Virginia in the years before and shortly after the American War of Independence, they must have found the twin humps of Brother Mountain comforting and familiar. Covered with native chestnut and hemlock, black pine and walnut, laurel and rhododendron, the lush peaks promised abundance and beauty, sustenance and shelter. The newcomers stopped, taking the soaring hawk and plodding turtle as signs that their journey had ended. They cleared the bottomlands, put down roots, and made their homes. Dermot Alexander, an Ulster Scot, was among them. For his farm, he chose land nestled in a broad hollow not far from Stillwater, a new settlement growing on the banks of the winding Turtle River. And he built his cabin so that when he rose each morning, he would see the early light spread across Brother Mountain like wildfire. A head taller than most of his acquaintances, with a flowing white beard, Dermot toiled in his rocky fields from dawn to dusk while his wife, Margaret, tended their livestock and their children. It was a life of hardship. 2 of their girls died in infancy, and a son, the youngest boy, nearly perished when a wave of influenza swept the valley, but also one filled with beauty. Dermot took the time in spring to savor the flowering of the hillsides, the dogwoods that looked like drifts of snow among the evergreens, the redbuds with their rivers of pink light flowing through the understory, the blossoms of the black locust that smelled to him like butter. And in the fall, with the harvest behind him, he paused to behold God's glory in the leafy flames that seemed to leap from tree to tree until the entire landscape was consumed by shades of red and gold. Margaret, who sometimes longed for her childhood home in County Donegal, had little time to notice the grandeur of the valley. If her eyes rose from her labor to the peaks of the Twin Mountains, it was because she detected on a breeze the dull scent of a spring shower or heard the rumble of a summer storm. She saw her husband gaze dreamily toward the hills, but she had no time for such nonsense. There were animals to feed, bread to bake, trousers to mend. And yet, she wasn't oblivious to the land. Over time, she grew skilled at reading nature's portents. It was she who foretold the blizzard of 1806, as if the earth itself had divulged to her its secrets. After the sickness that took her babes, she learned about native cures from an old Blackfoot medicine man who lived on the mountain, the sumac leaves that, when brewed into a tea, would cure asthma, the poultice of goose blood and sassafras bark that would speed the mending of broken bones, and her reputation as a healer grew. Born in the shadow of Brother Mountain, the children of Dermot and Margaret found their own solace in the natural world that harbored them, in the bog that muddied their bare feet, and in the forest that fed their imaginations. Elizabeth, the baby, freed from the chores that occupied her brothers and sisters, explored the farthest in her quest for the glittering rocks she admired. She searched for them in the rushing stream, tracing it up the mountain, filling her pockets with smooth stones, until she discovered, hidden behind a dense bramble and sweet hawthorn bushes, a narrow cave. Dark and ripe with smells she associated with her mother's animals, it was the perfect hiding place for her treasures, to which she would return again and again. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Cliff. Jessi?
All right. I like that County Donegal got in there, Cliff. Made me happy. Okay, so I'm going to read from a short piece of mine called Certain Robins. It was published in Gulfstream a little bit ago, but I had a really hard time choosing what I was going to read. And so this one felt just right. So, okay. When I drove into the field and parked at the edge, my mother looked wild, standing in the rusted bed of her pickup truck and pouring squirming mealworms on the roof. She threw the twitchy contents of styrofoam cups in great arcs, her oversized plaid coat flailing open. One second, there we go. Excuse me. I turned off the engine and watched the congregation of robins, 70 or so, fly in circles around my mother to land in her piles of sacrifices. They'd bring a worm into their beaks and then fly away a few feet to chomp and then return. As I watched their great confused number, I thought about how they had missed their own migration, but there was no real room to judge. I wasn't supposed to be moving home either. My mother had started to feed the birds when the fall had turned a surprising cold. The robins had chosen to stay, probably because they were certain there was more food in the field than where they were going, and of course, that displacement of seasonal patterns. Robins were no longer a sign of the changing skies, a sign of warmth on its way. Now they all fluttered confused in my mother's field in January. As I approached her truck, walking the left curving tire track to the middle of open gray field, she called out to me, "Hey, gorgeous, my gorgeous girl, hello." I smiled and hugged my coat tighter to my body. The wind picked up and a thin film of snow was puffing up in the air and covering my legs and pockets. When my mother jumped down from the truck bed, half of her robins flew up onto an overhanging electric wire. They looked down and cocked their heads. Hey, Ma, didn't know you'd be having company over for dinner, I said. She smiled to the birds and hugged me. Her shoulder smelled like ash and smoke from her fireplace, the powder of leftover shampoo. It was a reminder of her, of how she never wore fragrances, how it was far too expensive in the grand scheme of expenses. What are you doing here? She asked. The storm that's coming is going to be big. I don't think you should be up here by yourself. One of the Arctic blasts. -10 or 15 with snow. When was the last time we had that combo? I said. Well, I ain't leaving, she said, taking a step back. Robins flying back to their mealworms framed her. Well, then I ain't leaving either, I said, and she smiled again, the loose skin on her neck still surprising to me. Seriously, I got some jugs of water and borrowed my space heaters from the apartment. It's probably not good for either of us to be without the other this weekend. I could see her fill with this. She was thrilled to have me there, with a kind of turn in her lip that had always made me step back when I was a teenager. You're welcome to stay, she said. You're all welcome to stay. She turned back to the birds. But I'm pretty sure I can handle this old house without you. You'll just hold me back, my girl. Her robins twittered, and I just shrugged. As we walked back to the house, leaving her truck marooned in the middle of the field in a pile of mealworms, my mother smacked my back in the same manner my grandfather used to, and I could suddenly see myself in her walk. Our genetics reflected in how we dragged our boots through the 5 inches of snow rather than lift our knees high. The wind picked up and swept my mother's hair sideways across her eyelashes. She was skinny. She'd always been skinny. People always used to call her country skinny, as though eating out of her own garden made her that way. The wind is going to pick up really soon. It feels like someone with an ice cube in their mouth is breathing on your face, she said. I've never had that pleasure. You're missing out, Cindy, she said. I stopped. She paused too, her hair pulling behind her as though pointing back to her robins. My name is not Cindy, Mom. Her eyes focused on me. She frowned. Cindy is your sister. She's in Connecticut, I said, pushing my hands into my pockets. I know you're not Cindy. You're Taylor, my Taylor Reader. I named you that. Don't pretend I'm an idiot now, Mom said. She had started to slip 3 months before, when I had first found an apartment nearby and was starting to move slowly back home. I had stayed a few days with Mom while my water was turned on and cable set up. She spent a whole Wednesday asking me to go get my luggage out of the car, but I brought it in with me when I had first pulled into the yard the day before. Whenever this kind of mistake happened, she just passed it off, pressed forward, trying to focus on what she had been doing before her brain had tricked her. That time, she waved a hand at my explanation of how long I had been there and how many bags I owned. Then she went back to her task of butchering a chicken over the sink, the last of her own chickens that she had raised. It seemed as though her memory was like a passing vision. What had been solid in the world before was starting to slip. Her life before was merging with the now, age becoming foggy. I had noticed that this wasn't just in her brief mention of others or my name and birthday and my boyfriend. I'd been single for 6 months, but she would never remember this. But also in her feelings, her reactions. Sometimes she seemed 16, at times 30. Sometimes she acted her age, all of 68. She had always been youthful, and age wasn't really something that bothered her much anyway, so I could barely notice most of the time. But then again, she'd smile and dip her shoulder low with a joke sometimes. At another point, she laughed maniacally when she spilled her Coke and rum. She had laughed until she slipped down to the floor. The only thing I could do was act 16 too when this happened. Later, during the storm, she was 68. When the wind picked up, she looked out the wide picture window in the living room, sipping rosehip tea and braiding her long, thinning hair over one shoulder. I set candles out in holders and bowls on the tables and countertops, found the matches and brought in wood. Obviously worn out, she drank her tea and enjoyed for once someone else doing the little chores. It started to snow, first with the heavy snowflakes of a storm gaining speed, and then the faster pelting snow of a storm trying to be efficient. Then the wind came harder, and the window became a screen of television static. And I'll go ahead and stop there.
Thank you, and thank you both for those incredibly beautiful pieces. Let's start our conversation with a little bit of background. Can you both tell me and tell us about how, a little bit about your background as writers and how place has come to infuse your work so deeply?
You go first, Cliff.
Right. I always wanted to be a writer, but as Deb mentioned earlier, I had a career in international law first. So I felt like that was a bit of a sidetrack, but my career took me to Asia. I lived in Asia for a very long time, and even when I moved back to the States, I was traveling to Asia a lot. So my eyes were opened to an environment that was very unfamiliar to me. So I think that trying to ground myself in the various places I lived and worked made me very conscious of place, I think. So when I finally did get back to writing fiction, when I stopped practicing law, I had moved out to the Shenandoah Valley. This was about 20 years ago. And again, this was a place that was unfamiliar to me. I had not lived here before. In fact, hadn't really traveled here before. So my eyes were opened again to this unfamiliar place. And when I started writing about it, I felt like I really needed to ground my work in the setting that I was writing about. So that's what led to my first story collection, In an Uncharted Country, where I started building sort of a fictional version of the Shenandoah Valley, but drawing on the landscape and the people and the cultural history of the people and the settlers who came here. So that's really my feeling about place in the valley. But I've also written about other places. My second book was set in Washington, D.C., and I felt a similar obligation that I had to build that world in a way that really grounded the reader in the space, a particular building that I was writing about, and also the neighborhood, because that was crucial to understanding the story. And that continues to be the case in my writing. I'm working on a book now set in Singapore, and I'm really enjoying creating the atmosphere, because that's not a place that a lot of people have been to, but it's one that I know very well. So it's really fun to create that setting.
Thank you. Jessi?
Yeah, I tried very hard to not be a writer. For a short time in my life, I was certain that it wasn't going to be a good idea, and I tried to go into technical writing, but it chased me down, especially fiction writing. But I grew up in Clark County, Virginia, which is the smallest county in Virginia, and the one that is holding on to its zoning with the most desperation. And so I live very close to Northern Virginia, but in a place that's, that still feels fairly untouched. And so it's an interesting place to be, because you watch it as it evolves, but you have to really pay attention, because it seems like things don't change that quickly. And I think that's really where my writing kind of kicked off. The more I moved away from the place where I grew up, the more I wanted to write about it, and the more I saw a really important element in that. I was raised by my parents, but then also my grandmother, who was a Austrian immigrant, and I got a really interesting viewpoint from her that I just can't shake. She shows up in everything, I feel like, that I'm writing. And so when I write about where I come from, she is inherently in it as well. And that's very interesting to me. So environment for me becomes this very close connection with the people that make up that environment. And then tonally, I shift in that direction too. And suddenly my tone becomes almost a personification of that environment. And so when I went to school at West Virginia University for my MFA, I also thought it was really interesting, because I did not grow up in West Virginia. I am, over in the Valley instead, and that's where I've returned to now. But there was a lot of confusion over the labels of West Virginia, and if I was a West Virginia writer, because I write about being in a rural place a lot. And that I found really interesting, because there's massive differences in the cultures between these two areas, and yet readers often want to kind of place you in a nice little spot to know exactly who you are. And so that influenced me too, because it became this interesting way of recognizing not just where I came from, but how different it is to be where I come from. The class differences, the racial differences, so much going on right now, especially really reflects on that. And I'm really interested to see where how that influences my writing next.
Excellent, thank you. I'm wondering if you could both talk a little bit about, your engagement with the Valley. Certainly, Jessi, you grew up there. But Cliff, you've lived many places and actually came to the Valley, just in a life cycle speaking, relatively recently. And what aspects of living in the Shenandoah Valley and writing the Shenandoah Valley particularly interest you?
As I mentioned, I moved here just under 20 years ago, and I had never lived anywhere rural before, ever. Always pretty large cities, even when I lived in Asia. Except when I was a Peace Corps volunteer in South Korea, and that was a little more rural. But that aside, I was very young then. I'm not sure that counts. But so I was drawn to small town life, for one thing. I live in a beautiful town, or near the town of Stanton, Virginia, which is a beautiful little town with lots of wonderful sort of homegrown entrepreneurs, people who come up with their own ideas. It's not a place where we have a lot of national chain stores, so it's got its own identity instead of taking on sort of a homogenized American culture. So that was one thing that really drew me. It also is home to the Scotch-Irish settlers who came down the valley, and that creates a fairly unique culture here as well, because people have roots going back centuries. And I tried to write about that a little bit in the novel, The Shaman of Turtle Valley. People are really invested in the land and in their clans, for want of a better word. Really, it's they have ties to other people, and they've been here for centuries, and it's a little bit hard to break in. So that also was interesting to me. And then maybe the third thing was just the landscape. Having lived in Washington, D.C., and Boston, and Chicago, and Los Angeles, these are flat places. Singapore is even flatter, but here in the valley, I've got mountains on both sides of me, the Blue Ridge and the Alleghenies, and it's just a gorgeous place. And that seems to me to create a different kind of feeling, not only for me, but the people who live here, and then the characters in my fiction. I use these fictional mountains in the story that I call Brother Mountains, that partly because brotherhood is an important theme in the story, so I created these mountains that reflect that. But that's really true. The mountains are part of the environment. They're not mountains like the Rockies or real mountains, but they're still fairly significant, and they loom over us all the time. They're also a psychological obstacle when people go to Charlottesville, which is the largest, relatively large city. That it's only 40 minutes away, but they talk about going over the mountain because it is this psychological barrier to that part of the state.
Thank you. Jessi?
It's hard to even pull the environment out of it, I suppose. It's funny because the longer that I'm writing, the longer I'm recognizing that I don't even realize how consistently I reference things. I've noticed that I've written a couple of stories recently on a dirt road. It's like, I don't need any more short stories based on a dirt road. I'm probably okay with that. But it is interesting how I will produce something and it will just sneaks in. And what I've noticed most importantly about this is that I mentioned that evolution of things and how you have to really pay attention. And so I've been paying more and more attention to climate change and how that's really affecting things, and how in a very direct way. I find it very interesting when someone says that they don't necessarily recognize the shift, and yet I'm supposed to notice that the butterflies are losing their numbers a little bit this year. And it's funny to have such a little tiny thing. I mentioned the robins in my story because the robins have changed their patterns. And so it's this constant recognition that even if I'm not doing this purposefully, it's getting in there. And I think that that's very, very important, both for me to be self-aware of as I go, but also just as a ongoing theme. That's how literature works, right? Is that theme that sneaks in even when it's unintentional. But showing that time period. So for me, that's, a kind of a constant that's sneaking in. But in addition to that, I think that just culturally, I am so very aware of, especially of class differences. That's what I grew up with. That's what, and I'm interested in this because we always, they call it land rich when you have land and not much else. And that's kind of how I grew up. And so it's an interesting way to be, because I live in a place where if you have land, you must be very, very wealthy, especially a significant amount of land, because I am so close to DC. But that's not how it works necessarily. And so we have these expectations of this, and this starts to fold into my plots, and I recognize this pretty regularly. So even if I wanted to leave the environment of this place behind, I don't think I could. I think it would probably be present no matter what.
Interesting, thank you. So I'll ask you one more question, and then we'll start to open this up to discussion with the participants who are watching. So I'm curious, because you both live in a relatively small place, and I don't mean small as far as, like people live relatively close together and the communities are smaller. Okay. I was wondering how your friends, neighbors, relatives, etc., respond to the way that you represent the Valley and the people within it.
You want to go first, Jessi?
Sure, I'll go first on this one. It's an interesting thing. I think that as a writer being here, 1455 has been amazing because I've found other writers, and that really helps, right? Because it's much harder in a rural area to find your people in that way. In terms of how people respond to my writing, I find that I'm surprised sometimes about interpretation, and I'm surprised about the different issues that pop up that wouldn't have occurred to me within them, but that at the same time, commonly they're correct. It just didn't occur to me. And so the more that I write about a place that not too many people live in, the more people that read that place then give me that external viewpoint that I kind of need, which is interesting. I find myself, because I'm not as connected to the writing scene, right? I'm definitely not in New York City. I find myself needing to reach out and find different people. And the farther those people are from my current space, the more useful they are as readers, which is really interesting as well. So whenever I write a piece, I wrote a piece with a grandmother who wasn't too kind in it, and I had a lot of questions of why would she be hanging out with her? why would that relationship be existing? It's like, would you not hang out with her? Which is like, this is your grandmother, and that's such an interesting assumption on my part, that it's just I grew up in a very tight-knit family, and so the more that I reach out to people who are actually not here in terms of the writing crowd, the more I can recognize what's going on in my writing locally. I think people kind of see that culture that I'm presenting as well, and they can kind of attach themselves to it a little bit. So it's definitely an interesting balance between those two groups.
Thank you. Cliff?
My first collection of short stories, In an Uncharted Country, I consciously used real settings, although I fictionalized them, and borrowed storylines from newspaper articles about things that were happening here in the Valley. And some of them sort of really expanded way beyond reality, but some of them stayed sort of close to reality. So people in this area who have read that book, one, they say, oh, I really found those to be real people. Those characters, I understood them. They're just like people I know. And then a little deeper, some other people would say, I think I know who you're writing about in that particular character. And in fact, there was one story in the book that was based on something very specific that happened, and I was a little fearful that someone might recognize themselves in that story, but they did not. So that's good. The other work that I've done, though, is more generalized. It's not so specific about things that actually happened here. The Shaman of Turtle Valley is definitely more of an extension of my own experience rather than of local people or local events, and bringing in kind of a supernatural element. That the novel involves a woman who marries a GI, a Korean woman, and she comes to the valley, and she practices traditional Korean shamanism as a way of dealing with her own culture shock, and her beliefs, which are somewhat supernatural, interact with the Appalachian customs that her husband's mother follows. So that was a bit of a stretch for me, and the people who I know in this small town in the valley don't really do either one of those things. So they certainly didn't recognize the Korean shamanism, and Appalachian customs really don't happen in where I live either. So that's not really too familiar to folks. I guess that's all I've got on that.
Excellent. So the first question that popped up in the chat room was something that was mentioned yesterday, Cliff, about Cliff's list. And the writer asked if you could talk a little bit about the list.
So that's funny. I go to residencies or conferences or whatever, and we'll be talking about the writing world and literary magazines, and someone will invariably say, there's this guy who makes this list of literary magazines and places to submit. And it's like, yeah, that's me. So for the last 15 years or so, I have published annually a ranking of literary magazines based on the Pushcart Prize. And for people who don't know, the Pushcart Prize is an annual anthology of stories, essays, and poems that have been selected from nominations by literary magazines all over the country and Canada and the UK as well. And so this, in theory, is the best literature coming out every year from the small magazines. And I use that, and I have a formula based on the last 10 years of Pushcart prizes that have been awarded, and I come up with a ranking of the best magazines. So in fiction, there are about 250 magazines on my list. Those are the magazines that have either won Pushcart prizes or special mentions over the last 10 years. And the poetry list is about the same, and the nonfiction list is a little bit shorter. So I put that on my blog every year, usually in early December, shortly after the volume comes out. And I get a lot of hits on my website because people find it very useful. I created it as a way to help me choose where to submit my own short stories. When I came out of my MFA program, I didn't really know how to place a short story, how to choose where to submit. And so I would be sending things to the New Yorker and also to Podunk Review, not realizing that if Podunk Review took it, then I'd have to withdraw from the New Yorker, and that seemed like a bad thing to do. So I came up with a tiering system. So now I only submit to magazines within a range on my own list, and I recommend that other people do the same thing. So people have told me that they find it very useful, and I appreciate that.
I use your list, Cliff.
Do you?
It's awesome. Yeah, thank you. It's pretty fantastic.
You're muted, Deb.
Can you give us the address of your blog so we can direct people there?
Sure. My website is cliffordgarstang.com, and you can click on the blog link at the top, which gives you a direct connection to the literary magazine rankings.
Excellent, thank you. So I want to remind our audience that if you would like to pose questions to the authors, you can do so through the chat, and I will read those and communicate them through. So what I'd like to ask both of you is about, coming to writing at different points in your life. So Cliff, you definitely had a whole different career before you decided to be a writer full-time. And Jessi, it appears that you said that you tried to get away from writing, but you couldn't get away. So I was wondering if you both talk a little bit about, your paths and how you ended up here today.
I guess I was writing I was one of those people who was writing at too crazy of a young age. And so I definitely have had that kind of ingrained in me. It helped that it helps now that I'm teaching English for a community college, and so it's this constant in my mind now, which I always heard people warn you about teaching and how it would hold you back from your writing, but it's actually fueled me forward, which is pretty fantastic. And then with 1455, I went looking once I did move back home. I left, I'm a millennial. I graduated college in the middle of a recession. So I went into grad school and it was a great idea. And then I got out of grad school and it keeps happening. And so it made sense to move home. And it was one of the best decisions I've ever made. But here I was looking for people, and I went to just my local bookstore, and I was looking for places where I could either teach workshops or find a writing group. And she was like, hey, this guy, Sean Murphy, is starting something great. And so it's really interesting to see how much serendipity has brought me to this. But it certainly helps that I have just worked very, very hard to try to get through my writing and again, that serendipity or bad luck, however you want to look at it, my book currently is on hold because of the pandemic, and nobody really wants to read about climate change at the moment. So it's on pause. And it hurts, but it's also kind of part of the process, and everybody's kind of in that process right now as well. So digitally, even if I'm not sitting next to a writer at any point, I know that other writers are kind of feeling this, and I see that a lot in online communities as well.
Thank you. Cliff?
So I think I decided when I was in high school that I wanted to be a writer, but I didn't do anything about it. I chose a major in college that was a little bit off the wall for a writer. I chose philosophy, thinking that would be good preparation for writing the kinds of things that I enjoyed reading. I was a pretentious high school kid reading pretentious stuff. And so, but my father thought I needed to be a lawyer. And so philosophy sort of satisfied him as well as preparation for law school. And when I graduated from college, I realized that I had not read enough because it was not an English major. So I applied for MA programs in English. So this was a long time ago, and I had never heard of an MFA or MFA programs, and I don't think there were very many back then, but so I went to an MA program so that I could read the stuff that I hadn't read yet. And that really got me started thinking about what I wanted to write, but I still wasn't writing anything. And I also was realizing how impractical that was going to be for me. It looked like I wouldn't pursue a PhD, so an MA in English was probably not going to be very useful. And then I also was tired of school, so I joined the Peace Corps, and I was in South Korea, and that actually gave me this whole other trajectory toward international work generally and law specifically. So I got totally sidetracked for only about 20 years. And finally, sort of the last few years of my law practice, I started thinking, do I really want to be doing this, practicing law, for another 20 years? Or is it time to really get back to what I was interested in a long time ago? And a couple of things were happening. We had a new millennium, so 2001 was about to happen. I was had been practicing law for 20 years. Both of those seemed to be like good points at which to pivot. And I didn't really know how to pivot, but I talked to an old literature professor of mine who suggested an MFA program as a way of finding a community of writers. Not necessarily because I needed the teaching credential, because I didn't plan to teach, but because these connections would be very interesting, helpful for me. And that turned out to be absolutely true. And that's really what turned me into a writer, even though I had been dabbling at it for a few years at that point. I think the MFA program made me a professional as opposed to a hobbyist.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, thank you. Jessi, we have a question from a panel, observer rather. She said that she read somewhere that you grew up on a blueberry farm, and as someone who grew up in suburbia or in the cities, a blueberry farm seems like a very exotic location. She also asked if you could talk about how that place specifically speaks or sneaks into your writing through settings, themes, and characters, etc.
That's interesting. Yeah. I always tell my students that when I teach connotation and denotation, of course, it's a classic thing. And I always say that if you're a connotation for a farm, if I say the word farm, you picture somebody with a pitchfork and a cow and a pig. And for me, a farm was this big stretch of blueberry bushes and lots of heat and lots of bugs. And it was a great way for us to make some money on the side. It was not what we could use for our primary income as a kid. And so what this kind of produced for me was a really interesting combination. My parents were teachers, and then we had this farm, and it was this nice dichotomy for me between two very different ways of living and very different approaches to the world, so that you had just straight labor that you did to make money, and then you had a very intellectual approach that was very different. And so when I now teach and then when I now write, I recognize the difference in these things. And I commonly find myself also talking to and using the information from people who do that manual labor that I knew as a kid so well. And so it really creates a more three-dimensional aspect for me, I think, in terms of being able to recognize just when a landscape has changed and what that landscape produces, and that there are snakes in there. But at the same time, it's also producing this really interesting idea of what it means to be a human in your environment, and whether or not that means you are around other humans, or whether or not that means you are alone surrounded by green things.
Thank you. So Cliff, I'm kind of pivot back to you about this because you have also picked very distinct locations for your fiction, and you've talked briefly about your novel that will be set in Singapore. And so I'm wondering how that actually, has to change the way that you're thinking about both the characters and the stories.
The international settings really affect how the characters behave. I primarily am writing about people of my own background. I did write about Chinese American characters in my second book, What the Zhang Boys Know, but actually that book was written from the point of view of other people looking at this Chinese American family. There are a couple of stories in that book that are from the point of view of the father in that family. but mostly I'm writing from the point of view of Caucasians. And so in the Singapore book, I have an American who is moved to Singapore for work, and she is interacting with a lot of different cultures. Singapore is one of the most culturally diverse cities in the world, and so that's actually part of the story is her coming to terms with people of such diverse backgrounds and cultures. And I really wanted to address that. It's not something that I've addressed too directly before, but it seems very timely to me that we really talk about how people of different cultures, different races interact with each other, and where the sources of tension are. In the case of the book that I'm working on, she has arrived in this post-colonial environment, right? Singapore was a British colony for 150 years or so. It didn't become independent until around 1960, and a lot of the things that exist there are the result of what was imposed on that city in its colonial times. And at the same time, she's coming from a background in New York that has just experienced the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and she's thinking about the international actions of the United States that may have contributed to the resentment that others feel toward the United States. And that's sort of related to the colonial issues. Basically, the book is about unequal power positions, not only politically, but also culturally and domestically. So that's one of the things I think about. It's kind of like tectonic plates, where we bump up against another culture, and then something is going to erupt when that happens. But ultimately, the two plates settle down, at least for a while. In my novel, The Shaman of Turtle Valley, I don't think I addressed it too directly with this. And I do write a lot about people who are out of place when they arrive. So in that case, it's a Korean woman who has arrived in the Shenandoah Valley, and people do look at her because she's Korean and unusual in that environment. But it's also because of her beliefs, not just because of how she looks. Anyway, I find it all very interesting and impossible, and I think it makes for interesting fiction.
I agree. Thank you. So, another question that comes to mind when we're talking about place is the issue of nostalgia. And, oftentimes place-based writers, are so good at infusing the idea of place and the way it builds the characters, creates action, that, place almost becomes, a distinct character in some fiction. And I'm wondering, like how you strike the balance between the reality of what you're trying to produce while avoiding things like nostalgia or even stereotyping when you're recreating a place.
Yeah, it's a constant thing that you have to fight off. I think it is, nostalgia is something that we do very naturally. And I think it's definitely something that you have to reframe your thinking constantly. And so what I find is that as I'm talking about, especially this area and the history of this area, and what I was taught as the history of this area is actually quite different from the actual history of this area, of course, right? That's a theme currently. And so as I'm looking at that, I am better the more that I actually analyze myself, and I am better the more I actually analyze my writing, and that I recognize what it is that I am valuing in something and how that creates a character almost of my own thoughts, right? Because that is what, when place becomes a character, it almost becomes the writer, and that's what's dangerous about it, right? So I can tell you how many times I was taught as a kid the character of Stonewall Jackson. It was far too many times, considering the number of stories that I was not taught. And so this is something that is very, very important now, and it's very, very important as I continue forward. So I wrote a short story about turkey farmers, and I had to take a very, very long time to think about this. I write a lot of surreal stuff, and I had the turkey farmers. There's a common thing of the massive barns, when the fans shut down, that the turkeys can die. And they suffocate on themselves because they're so crowded. And I had to be very, very careful with that one. And I had to think back to, I am not a turkey farmer. I have to recognize that. And it's very, very important to recognize that group of people falls into stereotypes so very, very quickly. And yet they have families and girlfriends, and they hung out together in college, and it is very important to get that. And that's actually the best part about writing, are those details. So whenever there's a stereotype sneaking in, or whenever there's something that is that nostalgia, that has that flat quality, it's so important to recognize that means that person is actually not a character. That person is just a signpost. And so you have to go back to that depth of recognizing that they actually have thoughts, and they too were also influenced by their environment, and were told what to think, and then whether or not they agreed with that or not is very important. So it's very much, I think that's the best part about writing, is recognizing that three-dimensional quality. And so it only leaves open space for writers to explore.
Thank you. Cliff?
Because I moved here relatively recently, I don't fall victim to nostalgia so much, but I think I have a higher risk of relying on stereotypes, because I am creating characters not only from my current observation, but also from what I thought I knew before I came here about the people of the area. And that was a particular problem. I think I've wrestled that one down at this point, but I wrote a story that is in my first collection that dealt with no, I'm not going to use that word, a rural man who was not educated, who served in Vietnam, and came home and lived a hardscrabble life in the hills in a cabin. And I had to try very hard to make him real, instead of making him this caricature of what we think of as a hardscrabble man living up in the hills. And I made a lot of mistakes with his language, for example, which I think a lot of writers who write about Appalachia or rural people generally probably make early in their careers, until someone points it out to them. And fortunately, before that story was published, someone pointed out to me all the horrible things that I was doing with this character and the language that I was putting in his mouth. I was trying. The fact was that he wasn't dumb, he wasn't educated is the problem. And so I needed to make him smarter and more real. And so that's something that I think we all have to work on to avoid those stereotypes, is to ground your work and your characters more in reality, instead of some cartoon image that you have in your head.
Thank you. We only have a few more minutes. I'm wondering if both of you could offer some insights, commentary to what it's like to be a writer in the Valley.
Well, I envy Jessi for having 1455 to work with and to bring programming to her. when I came to Stanton, there really wasn't anything in the Central Valley. I created an organization called SWAG Writers, which is the Stanton, Waynesboro, Augusta group of writers, which is technically a subgroup of the Virginia Writers Club. And it was intended as a vehicle to sponsor readings, public readings, and we currently do an open mic night every month. We've lately been doing that on Zoom, but it still works. And the whole idea for me was to draw writers out of the woodwork and meet other people and see if we couldn't get some synergy and energy around the work that we were doing, and also drawing attention to ourselves as writers, and doing programs in local bookstores and getting people to be aware that the literary arts are alive in Stanton. So
Excellent, thank you.
Well, you know, I'm 20 minutes from everything, 40 minutes from most things, and so that people are really focused on. And I think that at the same time, you know, when I talk to someone, especially someone in my 30s like me, the idea of I just managed to get Netflix not too long ago. The idea of being cut off is quite overwhelming, and I understand this, but I think it's also really important to always realize that, you know, in Walden's Pond, he was not alone. He had neighbors. He just didn't write about them. And there's always that person that's there, and that there's always that community that's out there. And they may not be writers, but they certainly are interesting, and they certainly have a place for you if you're willing to have a place for them. And so I think it's really important to recognize that. And that's actually the beauty of where I live, right? Because I can find that. Every once in a while I'll be like, man, it'd be nice to live in Brooklyn. But at the same time, I also know that what I have here, like what they have in Brooklyn, is at the exact opposite end of that scale, but gives me something unique. And so I just have to massage that and really enjoy that. And then also do the work to find the people that are trying to write. And I think I spent the first 2 or 3 years of living here, I did a lot of work, and I'm trying to move more towards DC and recognize that. I know, Cliff, when I was down towards you, I found Writer's House in Charlottesville, and there's some really great stuff down there. And so I'm also got to be willing to drive, and that's part of it. But I know that, you know, through these different contexts and resources that, and then especially actually during all of these events during the pandemic, there's so much that I have become aware of, that I'm so much more aware of the digital events that are happening, but then those lead you to the people, right? And so there is a moment here where we can kind of recognize that even if you're living rurally, you have access all of a sudden, and then you can find that person that's not that far from you, actually.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you, Cliff and Jessi. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. Remember, the programming is free, so attend any and all other planners that you're choosing, and we'll be putting videos of each of our sessions on the website. We'll be sending out e-surveys after the event, and we welcome your feedback. And finally, while we have endeavored to make this entire event free to everyone, it's not free to produce. If you'd like what you're experiencing and want to help us subsidize this in future events, please consider a tax-deductible donation to 1455litarts.org. Every penny will help 1455 providing awesome, inclusive, and free programming. Thank you all for joining us, and have a great weekend.
thanks, Deb. Thanks, Jessi.
Hey, thanks,
Bye.
guys. Have a good one.
You too. Bye.